Readings from Old English, Number 1, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This extract is taken from The Keys of Middle-earth, Discovering Medieval Literature Through the Fiction of J.R.R. Tolkien, by Stuart D. and Elizabeth Solopova, published by Palgrave and Macmillan. Introduction. This is an entry from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year AD 755, and is generally given the name Cynewulf and Cyneheard. This is not the original title though. Strictly speaking, we simply refer to the text as the entry for the year, and only rarely do we give it a title. There are in fact 7 distinct chronicles, known as under the title of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which vary in the details and dates that they cover. In addition, at the end of the 10th century, an Anglo-Saxon writer named Ethelweard produced a Latin version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Chronicon Ethelweardi. Yet at the root of these is the same principle, an entry for each year going back to approximately the birth of Christ, but from the 5th century onwards detailing the history of the Anglo-Saxons in England. The early entries until around the late 9th century formed the core text of the Chronicle, but thereafter the manuscripts were distributed, and although the entries have many similarities, individual chroniclers played a part in the variation between the surviving text. The version presented here is drawn from the Parker Chronicle, more officially Parker Manuscript Corpus Christi College, Cambridge Manuscript 173, which is often thought to be the earliest extant version of the Chronicle. This is so called because it was owned by Archbishop of Canterbury Matthew Parker, who bequeathed it to Corpus Christi College, Cambridge in 1575. It is generally assumed that the Chronicle was instigated at the request of Alfred the Great, or at least during his reign, and so was initially compiled in the late 9th century. The first full section of the Parker Chronicle, for example, which covers the Cynewulf and Cyneheard episode, is believed to have been compiled in 891, thus some 140 years after the events recounted below. The chroniclers drew on other source materials, notably the Venerable Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, which appeared in 1731. Thus the further one goes back before the late 9th century, the less reliable is the information. Moreover, the dates are sometimes incorrect due to scribal error, but also possibly reflecting a wish to spread news across the years to give a balance of entries. The story of Cynewulf and Cyneheard is considerably longer than most of the entries in the Chronicle, or at least certainly those for the 8th century. It stands out as something which was clearly seen as important by the chronicler and his audience. In effect, it could be considered the first short story in English literature. And what does it tell us? In the simplest of terms, it details a minor blood feud in the history of the Kingdom of Wessex. It begins with Cynewulf seizing the lands of Sigebricht, justifiably so we are told by the entry. Sigebricht is depicted as an evil man, murdering one of his most loyal retainers, Cumra, but is eventually killed in revenge. This, however, is the start of the blood feud. 31 years later, Cynewulf attempts to drive out Cyneheard, Sigebricht's brother. Yet Cyneheard turns the tables on Cynewulf and surprises him whilst he is with his mistress. A battle ensues and Cynewulf is killed, along with his men. Yet the feud does not end there. Some of Cynewulf's men who had been elsewhere at the time they heard of their king's death rush to seek vengeance. They come across Cyneheard and after a brief siege kill him and his retainers. The text. Herr Cynewulf benam Sigebricht his riches, and West-Saxon wiotan for unrichten dadum butan Hamptonshire. And he havde da od he afslag donna alderman de him lengest woonede. Here Cynewulf and the West Saxon witan deprived Sigebricht of his kingdom for unrighteous deeds, except Hampshire, and he had that until he slew the ealdorman who stayed with him the longest. And hene da Cynewulf on Andred adrafde, and he da woonede od that hiene answan ofstan at prophetess flodan, and he rach donna alderman Cumran. And se Cynewulf oft Midglum jefeuchtum feat with Bretwal. Cynewulf drove him into Andred, and he there dwelt until a young man stabbed him to death at Privet stream. And he avenged the ealdorman Cumra, and that Cynewulf often fought great battles with the Briton. and an thrittig winter das they he riche havde, he wollen a draven an a atheling, se was Cyneheard haten, and se Cyneheard was thus Sigebricht his brother. And 31 winters after that which he had the kingdom, he wanted to drive out a certain atheling who was called Cyneheard, and that Cyneheard was the brother of Sigebricht. And daar je askede he dan a kuning little werode on wifkifte on marentuna, and hine daar berad on dan a boor utan beeode, hine daar men on funden they mit dam kuninge weren. And then he discovered the king with a small troop in the company of a woman at Merton, and he overtook him there and surrounded the chamber outside, before the men who were with the king might discover. Daar ongeat se kuning dat, and he on da dora eode and da onheanliche hine werede, of he on dana atheling lokede, and da utrasde on hine, and hine mitchlem je wonderde, and he alle on dana kuning whereon feochtende, of that he hine of slagene havdon. And then the king understood that, and he went to the door, and then he valiantly defended himself until he looked on the otherling. And then he rushed out at him and greatly wounded him, and they all were fighting against the king until they had slain him. And daar on das wiefes je beurum on funden das kuninges thenias da onstillnesse, and daar thede unon, swachwelch swadonne je aro weath on radost. And then because of the woman's cries, the king's thanes discovered the disturbance, and then they ran thither, whoever became ready and quickest. And here se atheling je welchem feoch, and feoch je bead, and here nanig hit je thigi en nolde, ach hier simle feochtende, whereon od hier alle legon, buton anam Britisham Yisle, and se swethe je wounded was. And to each of them the atheling offered money and life, and none of them would accept it, but they were forever fighting until they all lay dead, except one British hostage, and he was sorely wounded. Daar on morgene je heerden dat das kuninges thenias de him behaften weren, dat ze kuning afslagen was. Daar reed on heer thede, and his alderman Osrich and wiefeth his thane, and the men they he behaften him lafte and dan a atheling on their aburig meton, there se kuning afslagen lay, and the gater him to beloken havden, and there to eoden. When in the morning the king's thanes, who were behind him, discovered this, that the king was slain, then they rode thither, and his ealdorman Osrich, and wiefeth his thane, and the man which he had left behind him earlier. And the atheling met them in the stronghold where the king lay slain, and they had locked the gates against them, and then they went thereto. And daar je bead he him here agene dom feos and Londus, je fear him das riches udon, and him could that here meges him mid whereon, there they him from Noldon. And then he offered them their own judgment of money and land, if they would grant him the kingdom. And he said to them that their relatives were with him, those who did not wish to go from him. And daar kwaden hier that him nanig me le offeren nere dan a hier a chlafod, and hier nevre his ban on folgi and noldon. And then they said that to them no kinsman was more loved than their lord, and they would never follow his slayer. And daar budon hier a marum, that hier je sunder from eodon, and he kwaden that tat ilche hier je feren je bodem were, they mit them kuninge whereon. And then they offered to their kin that they may go unharmed, and they said that the same was offered to their companions, who before were with the king. Daar kwaden hier that hier thasna onmunde, thon ma they eore je feren they mid them kuninge afslagene waren. Then they said that they themselves were not minded to that, any more than your companions who were slain with the king. And hier da da gatu feochtende whereon, of that hier daarin a fulgen, and dan a atheling of slogen, and da men they him mid warem alle buton anum, Ze was thus aldermannes goldsonu, and he his feoch yenerede, and theach he was oft gewonderd. And they then were fighting around the gates until they fought inside, and they slew the otherling and the men who were with him, all except one. He was the alderman's godson, and he saved his life, and nevertheless he was repeatedly wounded. And ze Cynewulf riksede aan en thrittig wintra, and his leech leith at Wintanchiastra, and thus atherlinges at Ashenminster, and here a rietvader kun gath to Tjerdiche. And that Cynewulf ruled 31 winters, and his body lies at Winchester, and the otherlings at Axminster, and their direct paternal kin goes back to Tjerditch. You have been listening to an extract from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, read by Stuart D and recorded in March 2007. The text, translation and introduction were taken from The Keys of Middle-earth, Discovering Medieval Literature Through the Fiction of J.R.R. Tolkien, by Stuart D and Elizabeth Solopova, published by Palgrave and Macmillan.